Well, with the holidays, obviously, of the season here, we are discussing tonight something different than the politics and usually the arguments we get into, although there's always fights about religion, aren't there? But we are discussing faith and the role that it plays in society. And many reports which have come out past couple of years, they've put a fine point on it. And they all agree that overall participation is declining. A 2012 Pew Research report said 1/5 of all Americans are religiously unaffiliated. Let's, if I could, Rabbi, put this into real terms and, go back to the synagogue that you grew up in to now the one that you run. How are the challenges or the givens that you would have found, 20 plus years ago different then versus than different now?
There are a lot more choices for people, and there's a lot of pressure on people that didn't exist 20 years ago or 30 years ago. There were no smartphones, so when you went to work, but then you came home and you weren't checking your email, your voicemail, your texts, you weren't working, and so there was a different sort of family structure. It also meant that if you chose to go to synagogue on Saturday morning, that was what you did with your family, and it wasn't soccer and violin and ballet that was competing for your child or your children's time. You simply went to the synagogue, and your kids had friends there, and maybe you saw your friends there. Now our world just looks a lot different. I think the 5-day work week is history, and people feel like they need to be constantly on. To me, that says, well, this is a great opportunity for religion. Come to synagogue for an hour or two on your Saturday morning. Take a break. That's part of why it's there and what's so healthy about it, but that's not necessarily so easy for people to do.
Is there a different expectation from your audience on Saturday, what they want to hear from you, than maybe what they would have expected to hear 20 years ago?
I think 20 years ago, people were really looking for a very formal sermon. I think they were more open to that. These days, I find certainly at KTI, at my congregation, that while there are those who prefer a very formal sermon, I try to do a lot of discussion with the congregation. I like to hear what they're thinking and try to get them to engage with text or with ideas or with what's going on so that the conversation feels relevant to their lives. And we can look at the Torah, we can look at this ancient scripture and find ourselves in it. And to me, that's really at the heart of Judaism, and that's what I try to convey to people.
Reverend, and this may be more acute necessarily with the Catholic Church than certain Protestant denominations, but that constant tug between adherence to tradition and then at the same time the modernization and the making it more relevant to some folks that say the church doesn't speak to me or whatever. And I know it's a constant struggle regardless of faith here, but how does that get nuanced? I mean, you guys all talked before about coming to a common consensus that you would open doors to people regardless of sexual orientation and make it feel a welcoming environment, but that in itself was a change. How hard is it to navigate those two things? People want tradition, they want stability when they come on Saturday or Sunday, but at the same time they want relevancy.
Yeah. If I had that answer, I would probably be the head of our denomination and not a pastor. That is just a real tension. And in our parish, too, we have a fairly progressive congregation, I would say. And we have a fairly traditional worship service. And I wish you would have told me before I preached that I didn't have to do so much and I could have just asked a bunch of questions. Holy mackerel, it saved me 3 hours of hard work. God. Yeah, remember that when you preach at KTI, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I'm preaching next time.
All right, there you go.
Over there.
But seriously, I think that's a constant tension, and especially with our the younger families that we have. And part of that tension, too, that we have a committee we call an evangelism committee that we're really trying to address that and talk to them and say, okay, we know the kids have ski team, we know they have soccer, we know they have baseball, we know they have all of these other things that pull at them and you as a family. So what do we need to do in terms of what we offer to you for that spiritual, religious grounding that you want, or else you wouldn't be here. How can we make that more welcoming to you? Is it a different time of service, a different day, a different style? And we're really, I'm sure that we're all trying to address that same sort of question. You know, how do we do that?
You guys agree? Is it the fight that you're competing for time on the schedule, or is it that people just say, you know what, I don't want to be talked to for 45 minutes or an hour. I want people to talk to me about something I care about, where you almost have to cater the message, when before the message was the message, and you showed up and you sat in your pew or whatever it was, you listened, you kneeled when you're supposed to, you stand where you're supposed to, whatever the case may be. Is that the new reality here that you're selling on Sundays?
But I think it's more. I think that we need to bring the Bible into this era. Yeah. I think that, I cannot read the Bible when I was small and have a different message. And that's the relevance of the Bible, that it changed. But sometimes we want to keep it when I was at this time. And one of the examples, and I think you speak about two areas, put into that the second generation that come from Latin America, where the parents want to have that service, and the kids want to have that service, but in another language.
Right. Yeah.
And with another music, where you need to bring drums and guitar. Forget about the organ. They don't relate to that. So how you deal with that? And there's our struggle, because sometimes we don't have the facility or the personnel to deal with each one. One of the examples, we are trying now something different. Don't take the excuse. Is to have a sermon for kids outside my sermon, because it's very hard for me to, when I preach, to deal with both of them. Yeah. If I preach very casual, the old people look at me like, what are you doing? And they're the one that put the money in the plate. No, yes, you need to deal with that. But in the other sense, when I preach a very, constructive sermon, the kids start sleeping. Oh my God, when are he going to finish? So what we practice now is try to see how some youth deal with their problematic by themselves, and I could preach, or vice versa.
Just a real quick comment about what you said in terms of the relevance of scriptures. And one of the, I think, a wonderful example of what can happen is in Latin America with the Comunidad de Base.
Yes, Comunidad de Base.
Yeah.
And they have been flourishing. They have been flourishing because they talk to the kids on their term. And you got in Florida, you have some mega churches that is only youth. Only youth. So I don't think that they don't have faith. I think that the church has not been able to deal with them on their level. And we need to deal with that. Now, then we have the other part, the economic part. How we deal with those people that put the money in the plate. And that is a reality. We cannot deny that,
I think children's sermons is an interesting dilemma that we have. The church that I'm in now, they want to have a children's sermon, they want to have an adult sermon. But the comment that I get from a lot of the adults is like, I like your children's sermon so much better than your adult sermon. Because
some of them, yes.
It's to the point, it'll have some illustration, it'll have some narrative component to it. So I mean, more and more I just kind of say, well, let me just give a children's sermon and just stretch it a little bit more to tell the parents why we had this story today or what this meant. And I think that that's been working for me, to say that, as much as people want to have an informed, learned sermon, that makes them feel like they've done something important with their day, or they feel like that's what the pastor from 50 years ago, who they think is wonderful, that's what they did. But they respond more to a sermon that doesn't try to do a lot of brilliance. That just comes with a very simple idea.
The four of you clearly are trying to take proactive steps to reverse a national trend. I can tell you, look at the popularity of Pope Francis, and what everybody has their own take as to why. But to me, it was as if he opened the doors, the windows, and said, "Let's let some fresh air in, and let's have a conversation, and let's make this. It doesn't have to be stale. It can be welcoming. It can be relevant, and everything else." But there is a tension in the church, and I've heard it, depending on who the Monsignor, who the priest is. There are some that would like an even more leaner, more rigid church that is adherence to more conservative principles that makes no effort to, in effect, market. And they spit that word out with venom. The teachings that go back, more than a century. And from their vantage point, it's that we shouldn't have to change with the times. This should be something that is non-date specific. And when you hear that, and then you look at the different efforts while still being adherent to the principles of the faiths, that's the fight that's still going on sometimes. And I will tell you, that's what turns off so many people who sometimes are looking for an excuse not to maybe have a faith. They're saying, well, they make no effort to make it relatable to me. And I'm not just doing it because you're the four of you around me. You four don't subscribe to that, but so many different parishes, synagogues, churches do. And I think that's part of the problem. It makes it easier for people who say it's too much work to have a scapegoat as to not maybe give it a shot to have faith in their life, if that makes sense.
Well, it's so complicated. On the one hand, I think each of us wants to preserve and conserve our tradition. We believe in it, otherwise we wouldn't do what we do. And on the other hand, if we're dealing with people, and our job is largely to deal with people and to help bring them closer, then we also need to know where they're coming from and to have some respect for that and to figure out, well, which pieces of the tradition are relatable, which feel really real to people, and which parts maybe can evolve.
Well, it's a perfect point, Rabbi, for us to go to break, because when we come back, it shouldn't just be the faith leaders who are reaching out, according to many here, to try and, again, keep faith alive in families. What about families themselves, and what should the expectations be if you believe and you want to see your particular faith flourish? What are the